when you get into the space of the lover, it's not a matter of doing, it's a matter of being. It is not work. Not worried about making a living, you know, not into career, you know, not into studying sex manuals.
In this lecture about the lover archetype and its influence on the psyche within masculine psychology, Dr. Robert Moore discusses why men often struggle with accessing this energy. He explores how the lover is represented in various world traditions, mythology, and spirituality. By looking at aspects of beauty, love, and devotion. Join us as Dr. Robert Moore goes deep into the structures of masculine psychology, revealing the positive and negative sides of the lover within each and every man.
I said in the introduction to this course that you saw in the catalog that this is probably the most difficult archetypal configuration for most men. I say for most men, not all men. Some of you in the room here tonight are probably artists or people who shoot up with this thing, and it's where you live, and so you don't find it so difficult to get in touch with this thing at all, and so you're a little different from a lot of other men. Most men have difficulty with it in the other ways. They have a hard time trying to figure out what this energy's like, or it frightens them a lot. In any case, we men are wonderful at getting into trouble with this one. More of us men get into trouble with this archetypal configuration than with most of the others. So we'll be seeing why that is in a little bit. But let me begin. I want to before the break, I want to just lay out this geography and talk about how the lover interacts with these other archetypal configurations, so you can get a sense of the psychological assumptions upon which I work, and my understanding about the importance of Jungian psychology in looking at these things. And let me just jump into that, then we'll take a break at 8 o'clock, short break, stretch your legs, and then we'll come back and we'll get into all this phenomenology of the lover and try to get a feel for this thing. But let me just jump in now and say that it's been said by a scholar recently that there are two ways really to be related to Carl Jung psychologically today, really, in terms of popular movements within what we call the Jungian community. One, which we often refer to today as the post-Jungians, take Jung as a starting point and then move on to do other things which are quite different from Jung's work and have quite different assumptions than Jung had. That's one wing. That's not the wing that I am in. The other wing is made up of individuals who take their standpoint in Jung and try to continue developing the vision which Jung started. That is to say, I don't consider myself a post-Jungian. I consider myself a Jungian because I do not move away in any significant way, I think, from the fundamental theoretical assumptions about the structure of the psyche which Jung had. And let me just say a little bit about that. I've got, you hear all these other tapes, this is laid out in some detail in other places. But for those of you who have not heard that, let me just say a few key points. First of all, the key to understanding the uniqueness of Jung's system is understanding the idea of the collective unconscious. That is, Jung, following the great anthropologist Adolf Bastian, saw human beings as having a fundamental psychic unity. Underneath all their differences, there was a fundamental psychic unity. This was grounded in what he called the objective psyche. Now, this objective psyche is what I like to call in your hardware. This is not in the software. This is in the hardware, in computerese. That is, there are a lot of differences which we would call cultural differences, differences in the cultural unconscious, differences in the family unconscious we could talk about if we had a lot of time, differences in the personal unconscious. But at the deepest roots of the psyche, Jung believed there to be a collective unconscious. Now, the assumption is that these unconscious structures in the psyche form potentials for human functioning. I personally, along with Anthony Stevens, view these as grounded in neurophysiology. And if you're not familiar with Anthony Stevens' work, I suggest that you look at his books, particularly his book, Archetypes: A Natural History of the Self, to get a feel for a contemporary reflection on evidence for the psyche as having archetypal deep structures. Now, this assumption differentiates Jung from all other psychologists. Most psychologists operating today do not assume this kind of deep structures in the psyche. A great number of psychologies end up being ego psychologies, which tend to reduce everything to your personal unconscious, if they even treat an unconscious at all. So, to the question, why study archetypes? It's not an antiquarian interest. You do it because these structures represent potentials which, if you have some clues to how they operate, you can get some clues about the potentials that you have as a human animal, psychologically and spiritually speaking. And not only that, if you believe that the ego, the human I, has to form a conscious relationship to these structures in order to be mature, then you have to have some sense of how you would know one of them when you saw it. How would you recognize this structure in order to form a conscious relationship with it? In other words, how would you know when an individual was possessed by a warrior archetype? Unless you knew what the qualities of that archetypal configuration were. So it's not just an antiquarian matter, and it's not just a matter of Jungians wanting to be cute by finding a fairy tale to preface their essay. See? Let's get a fairy tale, and then we'll have our fairy tale, and then we'll talk psychology. Or we'll have a myth, and then we'll talk psychology. In other words, there's a reason for studying those things. And the key reason in terms of psychoanalysis is that these configurations are impersonal. And to the extent that you have not disidentified with these configurations and made them conscious, you're being lived by impersonal patterns and don't know it. See? So what is individuation to Jung? Becoming an individual. Sounds easy. Not so easy, because in order to become a person, you have to disidentify from impersonal archetypal structures. And all of these configurations are impersonal archetypal structures. Now, my work for the last 15 years has been in trying to get a little clearer about the deep structures of the archetype, of what Jungians have called the archetypal self. And in my work, I've come to believe that the archetypal self is structured both in men and women in this way. That there's an eightfold structure to the archetypal self in you, and it's the same in men and women. This is what Jung referred to as the mysterium conjunctionis, or the hieros gammas, the royal couple within. You see it in his alchemical text. You see plates of it. And I want to give you a little sense for the different spaces that open out. If you understand this stuff, you understand that the task of the human ego is to learn to differentiate how one feels and thinks when one is in a king or queen space, how one feels or thinks when one is in a warrior space in the psyche. This is inner space. I got called a cartographer of the psyche recently. Okay. How it feels when you're in a magus or magician space, or how it feels when you're in a lover space. So let me just briefly run through these. You can get the tapes which draw these out in more detail. The space, the emotional space of the king and queen archetype is the space of just order. This is the psychological resource, configuration, potential for establishing a center in the psyche, being in touch with what Mircea Eliade called, the great historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, called the axis mundi, the center of the world. If you have a lot of anxiety states, if you have tremendous energy but you're very frantic, you're not well enough connected to this. It is through connecting with this archetype of the king or queen is the way you get that sort of deep taproot. Put down the taproot in the psyche so that you can experience a sense of calmness and order. Without that, we'll be seeing later, without that, the energies of these other configurations do not bring you a sense of peace and connectedness. You also feel cut off from a source of good. You'll very likely be very depressed if you're cut off from that, because you'll feel like an orphan. Think how many times when you're depressed you feel like an orphan. If you look in world mythology, you see a lot of these motifs about the child whose parents are really a royal couple, but they've somehow gotten separated from this royal couple. And the longing is to be rediscovered by that royal couple. That is related to this configuration. So, all around the outside of this, you see this in world mythology, is chaos. When this center is put down, that's the cross in Christianity, that's the Kaaba in Islam, this is the Bo tree in Buddhism. It's the tree of life and world symbolisms of all kinds. The symbolisms of the center. You can get Mircea Eliade's book, Cosmos and History, and he lays out a lot of the imagery around this. Warrior, energy, warrior space. When you're in the warrior energy, everything is struggle. If you're not very well connected to the warrior energy, you don't have the focus you need in your life. You don't have the stamina you need. You don't have the capacity to strategize. You don't have the capacity to forget how uncomfortable you are. See? So that you can do the job. For the warrior configuration in the psyche, everything is the mission. Everything is the task. Everything is subjugated to a transpersonal task. The commission. All the language you've heard about vocation, someone's vocation in the deepest sense of that is related to that configuration. The space is the plane, you might say the plane of Armageddon. This is the archetypal configuration behind the Muslim concept of the mujaheen. Mujaheen means one who struggles for God. So the interesting thing is that when you get into this space, you will have an enemy. There's a great book that I've talked about in the Warrior course entitled The Old Enemy by a man by the name of Forsyth. And it's about the combat myth and about the way in which when you get into this space, I like to put the warrior couple, the warrior couple in search of and in defense of cosmos on this side. And you see that across the space, they are faced by the warrior couple serving chaos. And there's your worldwide combat myths. In that book, The Old Enemy, he lays out a chart showing all of the combat myths and how they parallel each other around cross-world culture. So if you're a workaholic, this is your archetypal configuration where you live. Everything is subjugated to the task, and you don't have really the time for a lover. When you have sex, it's more like wham, blam, thank you, ma'am. See? Or as in that country song, the woman sings, my baby thinks he's a train. He makes the whistle stop and he's gone again. That's the warrior man trying to be a lover. We'll think as we go about the way these men who are dominated by these different configurations, how they try to be lovers. Because it's radically different energy depending on what's dominant. So the warrior, he just doesn't have time. He thinks he ought to be able to read the manual and get it down right. Okay. The magus, this is the magician. And the magician is the one who interprets everything. You know, in the best times, if it moves, the king will bless it and nurture it, try to bring it into being. If it moves, the warrior will fight it or shoot it. If it moves, the magician will interpret it. And when a man who's dominated by the magician, as we'll see later, tries to get close to the lover stuff, what does he do? Think about it. Yeah, he does disappear. That's right. That's good. He's schizoid, really. So he becomes a voyeur. All voyeurs are people who are dominated by this magus configuration. And when they try to get in touch with the lover, they become a psychotherapist and listen to everybody else talk about their sex life. And where did you put that again? Tell me again. Yeah.
Sex, lies, and videotape.
That's right. That's right. Sex, lies, and videotape. That's right. So, you can think about it. If you tend to be a real heady person, dominated by the magician energy, there's a lot of voyeurism in that. A lot of detachment. In fact, one of the things when we get further into this, it's really fascinating to look at the way in which the traditional understandings of the forms of love parallel to these archetypal structures. And just as a little preview, let me do that for you right now. Somebody who studied a little bit about all that New Testament theology on the different forms of love, tell me what the three forms of love that they talk about are. Okay, eros. Eros. Philia. Agape.
Storge also for Buddha. And nothing for Magus.
And nothing for Magus. You get it? It's very interesting. We'll get more into this. When that king energy is dominant, it's agape. And we'll get into that more later. Warriors have a lot of erotic connection, but it is in that philia form. Comrades in arms. And there are many men who have known love most intensely right there. And there's absolutely no way to understand masculine psyche when it comes to this lover business if you don't get that. A lot of the attraction of sports to the male psyche has to do with the amount of love they can get in under the guise of beating the hell out of each other. That's true. And you see it really clearly when you get that sense of the relatedness of men in these warrior-like contexts. I just saw this interesting recent thing that Richard Gere did, this Internal Affairs, in which he plays a sociopath. And if you want a little picture of the shadow lover that has some punch, go see Internal Affairs. I'll give you some assignments of movies to see in a little while. But what I wanted you to notice when you see that Internal Affairs is the movie is very frank in portraying this touch between men who've been through warrior training together. There is an enormous amount of affection that you can see portrayed in this film between these men, but it's in this warrior mode. You can see it really clearly. The Magus essentially is detached. The Magus thinks up ways to make atomic bombs so we can blow all this shit up, so all these other people won't be getting off so much. I'm not making that up. You need to read some of the interesting work that was done back in the 60s by Marcuse and Norman Brown about the sort of the necrophilia. We're going to talk about necrophilia. The magus, who has no connection with this, no direct connection with the lover, is going to be a necrophiliac. He's going to think of ever more creative ways to destroy it all so they can't have it. See, I can't have it. So I'm going to think about if I'm going to study the hell out of you until I can destroy you by knowing you. And then after that, we'll figure up some way that we can just wipe it all out. We can deforest the entire planet. You know, I mean, later on, we'll get into the ecological dimensions of this. See, ecology is directly related to this archetypal configuration. The capacity to care about ecology is directly related to the lover configuration. The lover space, traditionally in imagery, is the garden. It's the Garden of Eden, and it's the Garden of Gethsemane. It is passion in all its forms. It is the space. This is not a space of doing. Get this clear. When you get into the space of the lover, it's not a matter of doing. It's a matter of being. It is not work. Not worried about making a living. You know, not into career. You know, not into studying sex manuals. I was thinking about country music, and one of the things we'll do at the beginning of after the break is to call on our saints, have a little communion of saints. And one I want to name here tonight in the context of the lover is Hank Williams Sr. If you listen to the lyrics of Hank Williams Sr., you get a little sense for the lover. He died, you know, when he was 29, drank himself to death. He knew about this lover archetype. He had a song called, "If You Got the Money, Honey, I Got the Time." You think about that. Now that's the lover archetype talking. See? If you got the money, I got the time. The lover has time. It's a radical different feeling about time.
Didn't he write, "She got the gold mine, I got the shaft"?
No. No. We'll have a quiz next week. US 99. So anyway, some people have an idea that maturation in the psyche is sort of like a soup. You integrate, you put all this stuff together and stir it up. I don't really believe that's the way it works. As maturation develops in the ego, the individual is able to access these spaces as appropriate and needed in the psyche. In a way that you can think about it's like the maturing ego gets the keys to the kingdom. And you can think about the kingdom as having all these different spaces. And you can't just mix them up. It'll become very clear when you think about it in some depth. If you're trying to get something finished, you don't want to be too aware of your lover archetype. You don't want to have too much influence on you, because it will make you very aware of your body, and you'll be aware of how tired you are. And you'll be aware of how much you need a drink, or whatever comes to you in that space. So it's not that you want to mix all these things up, you want to be able to access them according to the particular adaptive task that you're trying to deal with. There is a certain capacity for cross-fertilization in these things that enables you to realize the fullness of the potential of each of these configurations. And it does require some of the power, some of the energy off of each one of them to be able to realize the fullness of each. But you don't mix the spaces up. The spaces don't get to where they're just sort of one soup. This is one of the things which later on, the last evening, we'll talk a little bit about contemporary sex therapies, for example, in this context. Basically, what they try to do is to help you get into the garden, get into this space, and to totally take a very different approach to space, time, perception, the body, all sorts of things like that. And we'll talk about that some. Now, let me stop there for a minute, and let me see if you have any questions about what I've presented here as the structure of the psyche. This is, as I understand it, the structure of the self. And I will pretty soon, I've given a course on this that the Institute has tapes on, and I'll be publishing a book on this before very long. But the male ego needs to be built on the king side of this eightfold structure. The female ego on the queen side. And as you know, in Jungian psychology, we all have a contrasexual side called the anima, the animus. The way I understand the anima contains all of these in a man. The animus in a woman contains all of these. And so we'll think a little bit together about as you mature, how you need to be able, a man needs to be able to relate to the female side of these things as well. But in this course, we're talking about the male experience, the masculine side of the lover. Comments, questions? Yes.
You mentioned some positive things that each archetype did.
Yes.
The only thing you said for maggots is interpretation.
Interpretation, ritual leadership. The question is, what are some other positive things about the magician archetype? It is the archetype of awareness. You know, in Robert Johnson's book, Inner Work, this is the archetype of inner work. It's also the archetype of ritual leadership, the capacity to serve as a ritual elder for others. For example, in most of human history, the role of ritual elder was not the province of only one or two very select individuals in a tribe. When a man became a man, he had ritual responsibilities to younger men and others in the tribe. So this magus has the potential for understanding. It's the root of the word hermeneutics. Understanding and interpretation, awareness. It's what you have to have if you're going to understand all this psychic plumbing. You got to get your magician cranked up if you're going to get these things into perspective and kind of get an idea about when you need a little bit more of one and a little bit less of the other. You know, that thing about St. Peter being given the keys to the kingdom. That's magus archetype. And so the magus is very important. It helps you understand how your love is disordered and something about perhaps what to do about it, the inner Merlin. So it's very important. It is the archetype under which all psychotherapy operates.
Could you say something about the fact that chaos is on the feminine side of Gearsby and cosmos is on the male side?
Men tend to experience the feminine as associated with chaos, and there are some, it's a very historical thing. And in order to understand the male psyche, you have to get some idea about why that is. There's a lot of research coming out now about differences in male and female development, which lends some insight into why men tend to associate chaotic things with femininity. And it has to do with the asymmetrical nature of developmental challenges between males and females. Chartero's recent work, gets into that. But it's not just feminine. This is a male and female warrior of chaos. The mythology of Satan is the most dominant Western mythology. You might argue that the most dominant images of the warriors of chaos are masculine. And you'll see that if you look at that book, The Old Enemy. Most of the agents of chaos are seen as masculine. But my sense is that it's a couple, archetypally speaking. You get the couple, the warrior couple who serve chaos, and you get the warrior couple who serve cosmos. That's the archetypal kind of struggle. But it's not inaccurate when you're trying to understand masculine psychology. It's not inaccurate to note that men do and have historically tended to demonize the feminine, particularly because of their experience of, in their experience, a connection with the feminine often leads to chaotic emotional states. Yeah.
Isn't that found in the Bible? Still information.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot. He says, isn't there a biblical motif of Eve being the source of chaos? There are a lot of different images that present the feminine sources of chaos. I mean, you see this in all sorts of imagery, and for men, it's a very typical kind of imagery. And we'll be talking about some of the masculine experiences which may give rise to some of that. It's very difficult. Frankly, here's the way you got to think about that. I mean, it's like men, contrary to what a lot of people think, often don't experience themselves as equal to the feminine in power. And a great deal of problems, as we'll get into this when we talk about the psychopathology of the lover, a great deal of men's problems with being a lover has to do with fear of the feminine. I mean, completely immobilizing, terrifying fear of the feminine. In my book, you show me someone who has been a battering masculine, a man who has battered his wife or girlfriend. I'll show you a man who's terrified of the feminine and is into getting into the shadow warrior and having preemptive strikes on the feminine to try to control it. The therapy for a person like that is to help them strengthen their own warrior side. See, anyone who acts out violently like that is insufficiently connected to the warrior. It's very interesting, as we'll get to see later. and this is true for women as well as men, it's very interesting, if you're not connected strongly and adequately enough to your warrior, you will not be capable of intimacy unless the intimacy is very destructive, masochistic for you. Did you get that? You must have the warrior side protecting you from abuse, or you will either choose to stay away or you will choose to connect in a masochistic way, which will then swing into a sadistic form. So, contrary to what a lot of people think, very often men who are violent with their lovers are not men who are really warriors at all. They're men who are not convinced that they can protect themselves.
Does that go for psychological and verbal abuse too?
I would think so. The question is, does that go for psychological and verbal abuse as well as physical abuse? I think so. You need to think about this. Look at how often men who have difficulties in this area regress into rages and distancing. Narcissistic rages usually accompany verbal abuse in men or women. And you show me somebody that's in a narcissistic rage, I'll show you somebody that has felt violated and who feels very, very much in danger. Their selfhood feels in danger. If your self is in danger every time someone that you care about gets angry with you, then you're very likely to regress into self-preservation modes which include heavy firepower. So basically, here's the litmus test. If you lose your temper a lot with your lover, it's because you're afraid of them. You're afraid that yourself cannot sustain this intimacy, this connection. It will fragment. So you must drive them away in order to protect the integrity of the self. So it's a strange kind of paradox. So what you try to do is to get that inner knight online. The knight is not going to be too good at making love with the armor on, but that's not what he's for. You station the knight right here at the gate. You put him there, and you tell the knight, this is true for men as well as women, you tell the knight, now if some asshole comes along here and tries to abuse me, take him out. But if you hear me moaning, at least check out and see whether I'm being abused or not before you take them out. You got to have a discerning knight who knows when to come into the garden.
How does he discern what kind of moans those are?
Well, he has to know. Needs to study a little bit with a magician. Moans 101. How we know. I'm just half kidding. I mean, the point of it is that the night, this psychological reality has to be online to protect this space. It's very interesting because if you're a workaholic, your warrior is not protecting you well. If you're a workaholic, your warrior is not seeing to it that you get your time in the garden undisturbed. You know, your warrior needs to learn to stand at the door and say, no, you cannot see him. You cannot see her now. No, you'll have to wait. And if you're a nice, good king or a nice, good queen, and you're trying to make sure everybody is nurtured, and you're a good social worker, psychotherapist, clergy type, oh well, I've just got to have this agape, I'm gonna love all these people. Well, you'll never have time in the garden. See. So you've got to see the way in which all these different potentials have to be there for you. But in terms of this thing we're talking about tonight, it's very distinct. And it has to be protected because it's very fragile. It's a very fragile thing. It's a very delicate thing, that space. If you ever lost an erection, you know how delicate it is. You know how delicate this space is. See? Other questions, comments before we take a break? Yeah, Dave.
These are not all the archetypes.
No.
And the question is, why these four that you have here as what constitutes the self?
All right. Question is, these are not all the archetypes. Absolutely right. Why are these four, or these 8, I would say, chosen? I say this is the structure of this is the inner structure of the self. This is the forms that the archetypal self will break down into if you start splitting. And I'll explain more about that later. I don't know why they are. I just know that they are. And I simply look at the different ways in which you see these things manifest in archetypal materials in history, culture, and folklore. It's no accident that you see these 4 figures in practically all forms of cultural materials. I'm a Jungian. Well, Jungians view looking at cultural materials as a form of empirical research. These are not the only archetypes. There are many others. They are the things that form the structural pillars of the adult, mature psyche. Now, there are immature forms of these which have other roles. For example, the boy magician is the trickster. The immature warrior is the hero. A lot of people conflate the hero and the warrior, but the hero and the warrior are not the same thing at all. Very, very different. The divine child is the child king, the Advent, Christ in the manger. And there are female counterparts to that. The Oedipal child that you see so often in forms like Adonis, sort of the boy lover of the great mother, is the immature form of the lover. Freud's whole psychology is based on a psychology of the boy lover and the girl lover, not the man and woman lover. The whole Oedipal thing is a study of the role of the boy and girl lovers in human psychopathology. See? So basically, when you look at this, you look at the way in which the images of maturity and masculinity and femininity are portrayed in different human cultures cross-culturally. I will submit to you that if you will look, this is what you will find. Cross-culturally, in any human culture, you will find essentially these 4 structures in both the images of the male and the female. So, other comments or questions before we stop? Yes.
On that energy thing between king and warrior. For king, you said lots of energy but frantic. For the warrior, you said lots of energy but poorly connected, no focus.
No, you got it backwards there. The king is very centered. Calmness, the peace that passes understanding.
If it went wrong.
If it went wrong, that's right. If it went wrong. If the warrior energy is not connected with properly, you will get a lot of fiery energy. A lot of fiery energy. Mars. This is the space of Mars, Aries. A lot of fiery energy, but it shakes a lot, vibrates a lot. It's the workaholic space. See. So there's a whole shadow side that emerges when these energies are too dominant. Any of them are too dominant. So you can think about it as sort of 4 pillars. If any of them are weak, then you get some pathological expression. In human, as we'll see later, in human religion, the images of God often include all these together. And I think that's the way you think about the archetypal self, and we'll get into that after the break. You can see in discussions of various gods, you can see it's like a jewel, which you turn the jewel, it has different facets. And you will notice that you can think of the God, and you can see traditions in any religion. You can see the traditions about the God which view them in each of these configurations. And the qualities of the God are radically different depending on which side of the jewel you're looking at. And we'll get into that more after the break. Yes?
Is there a positive side to chaos? Or is that usually...
Well, in terms of human mythology, chaos is not seen as a positive thing. A lot of people get confused. They confuse chaos with liminality, or the space of dissolution. But when we study anthropology, we find that transformative space is not chaotic. It is structured. It's just a different kind of structure. If you study Victor Turner's work, his work on, particularly in the book The Ritual Process, his work on liminality. This is the space of liminality. So transformative space, which would be the closest thing to what people would call chaos, is not at all chaotic. You get chaos when there's no containment, where there's no ritual leadership. You get chaos. And so in the history of the human race, chaos is seen as associated with evil. Look, for example, at the book called Anthropology and Evil, and it lays that kind of thing out. That and the Old Enemy book. Chaos is associated with destruction of human worlds. And well, there are people that romanticize it, and they kind of associate, for example, they associate the death side in a death rebirth cycle with chaos. But in my personal view, that's a misunderstanding of the human experience of ritual process. The dissolution phase in the psyche, if you'll study human ritual, always transfers the center out of the center of the human consciousness to a transpersonal center. You got to study Iliadi to get that. In other words, chaos and death and evil are associated in the human psyche. See, doesn't mean it's not there structurally. I mean, that's a theoretical question. Do you think there's an archetypal shadow or not? Do you think that there's some principle of disorder in the psyche, in the hard wiring? That's a theoretical question. A lot of people argue about that. If you've heard my lectures on psychology of Satan, I think there is an archetypal shadow in the hard wiring. See? Which, if it gets constellated, will hasten your death fast. But do I think that's good? No, I'm a shrink. I see what it does to people. I spend my time making war on that shit. So I don't romanticize it. I see people's life going right down the tubes of chaos. See? But that's my personal opinion. I could be wrong. Let's take a break. We need to... Yeah.
In regards to archetype, you mentioned that they were impersonal.
Yes.
Would that be the same as being pre-personal or transpersonal?
Both. Question about the archetype. I said that it's impersonal. He says, is that pre-personal or transpersonal? It's both. That is to say, these things form the materials out of which you create a self with a little s. That's individuation. Individuation is the human self emerging in its beauty and balance. And so in a sense, if the archetypal structure out of which you create this is pre-personal in a sense, it's also transpersonal. Because these things transcend any individual. And you can just study the more, there needs to be a lot more work done like Jung did it, the cross-cultural studies. There are too many Jungians today that don't do any cross-cultural studies. See, in my view, to be a Jungian, you go to the cross-cultural materials. Otherwise, you think that doing dream interpretation makes you a Jungian. Everybody does dream interpretation. What's the difference between a Jungian and a Gestaltist? With a lot of them, there's not any difference. But somebody's doing it like Jung did it. The person who's a Jungian gets into the cross-cultural, historical, and comparative study. So you can see the structures. So that when you look at a dream, you know what structures you're seeing. And so you have some sense about what they're for. But anyway, that's some more, to honor Gestalt, that's some more elephant shit. As Fritz Perls would say. And it's very appropriate to mention Fritz, and tonight we're talking about the archetype of the lover. Because Gestalt psychology is a psychology that operates under the archetype of the lover. You think about that. You think about different psychotherapeutic approaches, and they tend to be in one or more of these configurations. But let me jump in now. Let's just get a sense try to get some sense for this particular space. And I want to start out, let's invoke some saints. Which, if this was on the conjunctio, we would talk about the female lovers. We'd get, Janis Joplin and all these folks. But let's stick with the male side now. Let's talk about men who have been priest and high priest of this energy, and who are now not with us. And I'll name a few. And remember, I'm not saying balanced. I'm saying high priest of this energy, and I'm gonna name a couple, and then let's have you name some that you think would be this. Richard Burton, Jimi Hendrix,
Jim Wilson.
Jim Morrison, Elvis Presley, the king of love. And you think about these folks. Louis Armstrong. He's still alive, thanks be to God. Chuck Berry, they said. These are all people. Let's just stay with people that if you're going to invoke the communion of saints, see, each one of these configuration has a communion of saints to go with it. John Lennon. Just folks that have passed. No, I don't think that. That's king. That's king energy. Let's stay with people that are deceased. Vincent van Gogh. Casanova. There are a lot of us. Think about it. Be thinking about it. Yeah. See, you can think about one of the things you want to do. Well, this gets us ahead to the last week. When you start thinking about ways of accessing this energy, you need to have your communion of saints. Okay. Need to have your own communion of saints. As I said earlier, Hank Williams is one of them. Robert Browning.
Mine?
Yeah. And you just work on your list this week of your saints, people that connote that for you, because what would connote it for me won't connote it for you. But one of the things we'll talk about the last session is, imaginal techniques, among other things, of accessing this energy as well as others. And one of the things you ought to develop is your list of saints of the archetypal lover, priesthood, this type of thing. And you will notice, we'll get into this a little bit, that historically this is affiliated with music, dance, and the arts a lot of the time. And it's no accident that we get into pathology of this. There's no accident that so many creative people mainline this thing and have difficulties that are related to mainlining the lover stuff. See, let me start a little bit with talking a little bit about mythological sources. You can see this in world mythology, and you can see it in all the world's mythologies. Now I'll just mention a few here. Of course, the one that Jean Bolin has picked up, and if you haven't seen her Gods in Every Man book, you ought to look at this. It's a really useful book to think about masculine psychology. Her discussion of Dionysius in Greek mythology is an excellent discussion of a certain aspect of the lover archetype in men. And I'll be talking a little bit more later about the way in which this kind of Dionysian motif reflects some of the difficulties that men have when they're really in touch with this energy. When they don't just completely split it off and project it on somebody else. But when you really get in touch with the archetypal lover energy, you start having some issues come up that that are like the issues that the Dionysian man has that Bolin talks about. So you look at Dionysius in Greek thought. It's very interesting when you look at Hindu mythology. Hinduism, in many ways, is the cultural tradition which has a rich development of this lover motif, this lover archetypal material. It has not been cleaned up in Hindu thought and culture. In fact, many of the very things that make Indian culture, not Native American, but Indian culture, difficult to get a handle on. For example, socialist. You know, people go into Indian culture and they try to get that rationalized. You know, they try to get all that warrior, king, organizational energy going, and they find that, you know, someone once said something about wishing that the Chinese communists would come in and try to take over India and see what would happen. And their implication of what they said, they didn't think they would do too well. And very probably it's one of the reasons for that, if it's true. Who knows if it's true, but I think what that person was feeling when they said that was the richness of the lover archetype in Indian culture. I mean, if you're familiar with Indian culture, you see it in the way the foods are presented, the subtlety of the smells in Indian cooking. There is an incredible richness in Hindu teachings about various yoga traditions. It's very interesting that, for example, look at Wendy Doniger's book. It used to be Wendy Doniger O'Flaherty, but we know her now as Wendy Doniger. Her book, Shiva, the Erotic Ascetic. Speaking of the great, powerful god of the Shaivite tradition in India. She makes it very clear in there that Shiva is so full of himself erotically that he's tempted just to be erotic all the time. But he also is so full of the sort of the magician, what I would call the magician energy, that he's tempted to be ascetic all the time. And so there's this enormous tension in the person of Shiva, this Hindu god, that is never resolved in any of the myths. It's always a tension, this tension between these different sides of his nature. And the lure of delight is so powerful for this god that it never is domesticated. It can never be domesticated. And if you look at this stuff from the point of view of masculine psychology, you really get a sense of the Hindu experience of male phallic transpersonal energy, because the symbol of Shiva is a great phallus. And if you go to the great Shiva temples, as I have off the coast of Bombay, and go in the temples and see the enormous Shiva linga in these caves, and see the reverence with which the Indian people treat this particular energy. I mean, you see the incredible reverence for a non-domesticated, masculine, erotic power. And in the Shaivite tradition, this is the most fundamental energy in the universe. How high is this great phallus? It is so high. It is so high that all the other gods try to fly up to get up to the top of it, and they've never been able to find the top of it. It is so high. Somebody's been taking cocaine, see? It is so deep that none of the gods have been able to find the bottom of it. And so all the other gods can do when confronted with this great phallus of Shiva is they fly up and down it. And the worshiper can just bring a little butter. and rub on it. So you get a little sense. They don't have this Christian problems with that. I'm going to get to some Christian hymns that kind of get at that a little bit in a minute. But the other tradition that I want you to look at, I really wish you'd look at some of these myths during this course so you can get a feel for this. But the traditions about Krishna are rich with this type of thing. In my Hyde Park consulting room, I have a Indian painting of Krishna and the gopis, in which they're all doing a Krishna, the god, comes to all of these souls represented as females, the gopis, the cowmaids, and he's dancing with all of them in a circle dance, and you see the mandala there. And the thing that's so wonderful about the Krishna traditions, and if you know any of the Krishna people here in Chicago, or if you've studied any of their sensibilities, you get this sense that they have this incredibly beautiful sense of the beauty of this God. I mean, that's the thing that strikes them the most. The beauty of this God. This God is so beautiful. This God may not be particularly moral sometimes, or any of the other things that people in the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions tend to associate with the God. But this Krishna is a lover par excellence. And if you get into trying to understand the mythology of Krishna, you must understand that he is first and foremost a lover. And that when he plays his flute, and you hear that music, he's got you. Get that? You hear the music, and he's got you. You're enthralled by him. And what you're enthralled by is just the beauty of it. And you want to dance with him. This is, I mean, if you talk about the Lord of the dance, I mean, Krishna is the Lord of the dance. And the book I wanted to recommend that you look at is a book of medieval Hindu poetry. I put it in the catalog, Jayadeva's Gita Govinda, called The Love Song of the Dark Lord. And it is all of this wonderful poetry, erotic poems between Krishna and Radha, the goddess, his partner. So you want to look at that. I think of all the world's traditions, the Hindu mythological and religious tradition is the most accepting and celebrative of this. And you see this very clearly. You've heard of the Kama Sutra, right? Well, Kama, the way, is a yoga. It is a yoga of love. And so in the Hindu tradition, you have the way of devotion. You have the way of the householder, way of work, all these things, all these other ways. But you have the way of love. And it is a yoga equally prized, at least, with all the other yogas. So it is a way of liberation, just as these other more ascetic approaches to yoga. And there are all sorts. If you go to one of these New Age bookstores, you'll see these books, Sexual Secrets. You know, well, what that's about is the way of Kama. K-A-M-A. So look at that stuff as you're beginning to look into this mythology.
When you're hearing music that goes along with the Gita Govinda.
Yeah, I wish you would. If I thought about, I've had some nice fantasies about playing music for you guys to set the tone of these things. And one of the things I thought about was maybe getting some of those Krishna bhajans. that the people that dance this play. And if I can get hold of one of those tapes, maybe one of the sessions, we'll put that on a little bit before the session, so you just kind of get a feel for these bhajans, this praise of the Lord Rama. I mean, you go to places in the world where the Lord Rama is alive for people mythologically, and they sing to him all the time. I mean, they sing this praise to the Lord Rama. And you get this feeling for how the beauty of Rama. And so I'll try to find some of that. I don't know if I'll be able to do it. Let me talk a little bit now about Christianity. What you ought to do is to try to get a hymnal, a Christian hymnal. It can be Catholic or Protestant, doesn't really matter too much. But go down through there and look under the section on love and read the hymns on love. And you get all sorts of clear expressions about Christ the lover. And the Gospels, particularly the four Gospels, present a lot of images of Christ as the divine lover. Going so far, even in some texts, talk about God is love and that sort of thing. All of the songs around Christmas, around Advent, the Christmas mythology is about the birth in the world of love. And it would be impossible to get a feeling for Christian mythology without seeing this side of the Christ of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is one of the very most central things. Now, this side, the archetype of the lover, is really not highlighted a lot in some traditions. For example, if we take the Roman Catholic tradition, now, if you're a Jesuit, you don't highlight Jesus the lover all that much compared to the more martial motifs, the more warrior motifs. If you're a Franciscan, however, there's a lot more permeation of this archetype of the lover in the spirituality. It's very interesting to look at different denominations, different religious orders, and think about which archetypal configuration tends to dominate in that order. In Protestantism, for example, in the Reformed tradition, you get a downplaying of the archetype of the lover. In the evangelical Christian traditions, you get a little bit more of a puffing of the archetype of the lover. For example, in gospel traditions, in gospel music, you get a lot of emphasis on Jesus the lover. And there are a lot of old gospel songs where you see this very clearly. I like to tell the story about the editor, actually, of a major hymn book, who back in the early 60s, they just come out with this new hymn book. I will not name the denomination. And this editor of this hymn book was to have a celebration of his new hymn book at this theological seminary. And his students decided that they would have a little roast. So one of the very attractive young women music students dressed up in a very, very Peggy Lee, torchy red dress, red cabaret singer's dress, and sort of hid back at the back, and they were having this presentation service, and so they had brought him down and sat him down the front row, and at the right time, one of the sort of local jazz pianists came up, sat down at the baby grand, and started playing some bluesy jazz licks. And then she started down the aisle in this big solemn assembly, you know. And she came up toward him and she sang, "Have thine own way, Lord. Have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still." Brought down the house. And if that editor is hearing this tape right now, his face is a little as red as it was that day. I mean, that was quite a scene. Brought down the entire house, you know. But you know, with it, that's not the only one you could do that with. If you know anything about those old evangelical hymns, they're very erotic. The reason they're erotic is that this lover stuff is right there. It's just that in our Manichaean tendencies in Christian, our dualistic tendencies in Christianity, we tend to want to deny this has anything to do with sex and the body and all that good stuff. We think it's all real spiritual in some disembodied way. But if you understand this archetype, you can feel the embodiment of that stuff in these hymns. And today we're much more capable of speaking of sexuality and spirituality in the same breath. Back in the 19th century and even early 20th century, we couldn't really do that. I've talked a little bit about Hindu motifs. Let me just say a word about love in the Buddhist tradition. It's very easy to miss the motif of the archetypal lover in Buddhism, but it's very, very powerful. The reason it's easy to miss it is because of all that emphasis on asceticism, particularly in some of the traditions, Hinayana traditions, and the dominance of that magus configuration. You know, that monk magus sorcerer configuration tends to obscure the power of this lover stuff in Buddhism. But if you look very closely, you really see emerging, particularly in the idea of the compassionate Buddha. See? In fact, you look at Kanza's book, The Teachings of the Compassionate Buddha, and you look into those bodhisattva traditions where they talk about the persons like Kuan Yin, who is the female representation of the bodhisattva of compassion. But there are many masculine embodiments of that. And the idea of coming in and being a blessing, being a river of compassion to all creatures, is the lover archetype manifesting itself in Buddhism. And there are many, many rich forms of Buddhism where you can see this very clearly. Now, yeah, Steve.
In terms of Judaism, for this archetype, are you familiar with Hasidism?
Yes.
Do you think?
Oh, yeah. The questions about this archetype in Judaism, you can say a lot about that. He's saying that you see that clearly in the Hasidic tradition. That's absolutely true, but you see it in a widespread manner in Judaism. In many ways, Judaism is much more comfortable with this archetypal configuration than Christianity has been in many of its forms, certainly as it has to do with ordinary life. For example, the sensibilities that you get, if you've been to Fiddler on the Roof, if you go to Fiddler on the Roof, you'll get a feeling of the lover modality as it's expressed in the tradition, and that's richly expressed in lots of different forms. The love of ordinary life, the sanctification of ordinary life, the joy, the dance, the blessing of so many aspects of and enjoyment of ordinary things in life. For example, it's very interesting. See, can you imagine a rule for Christian clergy and priests that you have to make love to your wife on the Sabbath? See, in many, in the Jewish tradition, sexuality and this configuration is integrated in so that it's understood that there's a sanctification, that is making holy, that this aspect of life is very holy and lifted up. And you could do a lot more with that, but we don't really have time. Let me talk about folklore, fairy tales a minute, and then let's talk a little bit about popular culture some more before we run out of time. In fairy tales, this motif is very rich, the archetypal lover, and you see it, I think, most clearly in all of the motifs around the kiss in fairy tales. And for example, if you look at Sleeping Beauty, the image or the way in which the kiss awakens, brings to life, is a servant of life. And you ought to be thinking about what is there about the kiss that is related to this archetype. After next week, you'll be able to get a feel for it, I think. That is, the kiss is a capacity to awaken through a kind of a gentle valuing. And that is something that is presented all throughout folklore, the magic of the kiss. But it's an embodied form. The kiss brings an end to enchantment, see, or bondage. The kiss is a way of liberation in folklore. And if you look in your fairy tales, you will see all sorts of motifs around that, and you should particularly look at that fairy tale and think about the liberation brought by the lover who comes. Yes, it's the same thing. Yes, and if you look at mythology, you kiss frogs, you kiss hags. In a lot of the myths, if you read through Joseph Campbell's Mask of God, and look at all those. See, Joseph Campbell did a lot of things with the mythology of the lover. And if you look through his set, The Mask of God, you'll see a lot of his elaborations about this motif and the transformative effects of the kiss for the person who's courageous enough not to run. We'll be thinking about that as we go. Yes.
Not to make too big a pun on it, but where does the kiss of death fit in?
Well, there's a thing in this archetype. The question is, well, where does this kiss of death business come in? That's where we get to that Dionysian kind of energy, and Woody Allen, love and death. I mean, there's something in this archetype that in male experience, there's a kind of a linkage in there somewhere between love and death, and what's one of the things we want to be thinking about as we look at the positive potential of love and then at the pathology of love. Just briefly at this point. There is a sense in which in ecstasy, one experiences a kind of a death of the ego, the separated ego. In other words, this archetype is going to try to get you so into somebody else or something else that you lose yourself. See, and that's a kind of death. Excuse me?
You're talking about a projection or?
Well, it can't.
Somebody.
Well, we'll get into that a lot. The question he's saying, well, is that a kind of a projection? We will talk about these lover projections and what the self-psychologists today talk about as self-object transferences or self-object relationships, kind of fusions that we get into with other people. That's related, but whatever you want to psychologize about it all you want to. I mean, tonight we're not psychologizing it so much. We want to just get the feeling of it. When you're into this thing, you just want to get into things. You want to get into it. You want them to get into you. You want to lick it. You want to find all its apertures. See? And the more ecstatic and erotic the experience, the less the concern for boundaries. And see, if you're an artist, when you're doing some of your best work, you're kind of losing track of where you stop and the creative act begins. And one of the things that I will talk about when we get into talking about the pathology of the lover is the problem that you get when you really start connecting with this of overstimulation. I mean, that's the way they talk about it today in psychoanalysis. It's kind of a calm word, overstimulation, Overstimulation, But if you're dealing with this thing, as many of you are probably, the more creative you are, the more you deal with this. You get into something or someone so intensively that you cannot shut it off. That's like that country song, whoever turned you on forgot to turn you off. And it's that you just can't stop. Or it's like the Rolling Stones, I mean, I can't get no satisfaction. I try, though. And I try, and I try, and I try. Okay, which gets us into drug, sex, and rock and roll, which is the locus of this archetype. I mean, I wasn't kidding you when I said I would have played Give Me Some Lovin' for you, because you would have a lot better sense for this archetype without me talking about it if you hear that song. And I'll try to arrange to be able to play you some of this raw energy. See, if you get, Bach, Jesu, joy of man's desiring. Now that's the lover archetype, but it's real refined. And it's real balanced. Bach kind of had all these things serving that Jesu, joy of man's desiring. Even turned on Bach, I mean. Now, what we'll have to play for you, is some of the Stones, or you country music lovers, Hank Jr. when he's on a roll. Start looking at the music side of this thing. See, it's no accident that so many rock stars burn up and die young. And this is the energy they get into. You don't want to live to be old. In fact, you can tell somebody that's really shooting up with this thing because they can't imagine themselves 40 years old if they're a young person.
Who's still alive and kicking?
Yeah, that's right. Anytime you see any of these, like this recent book on the Stones that came out, this aging faces. Anytime you see aging rock stars, you say, say there's some structure there helping them balance that stuff. because the ones that burn up just didn't have the balancing resources to try to help them maintain their selfhood in the face of all that energy. You want to, if you haven't been to a rock concert, you don't, that's the temple of this god. And it's true pretty much of practically any really, really powerful popular musician in concert. If you go to these concerts, if you haven't been to one, if you read about it and study about it and all that stuff, but you never go to any of these concerts, during this course you ought to try to go to some live music. Get the reader Thursday, and this weekend go out, hear some live music, and try to get a feeling for this energy, because that live music context is the space of this archetype. Now, we are out of time. I want to talk a little bit about films. There are a lot of films that deal with this thing, and I want you to try to look at some films as you're kind of trying to immerse yourself in this energy. Your family's going to wonder what's going on. But I'd like for you, at least before next week, to see Zorba the Greek. See? And see if you can get any of the films done on D.H. Lawrence's works. Women in Love, Sons and Lovers, even The Rainbow. Okay? A lot of other things about the Shadow Lover. Think of other films, positive and negative aspects of this lover stuff that you think people ought to see to get into this energy. Play Misty for me. That's Shadow Lover. Last Tango in Paris. Yeah, there. Yeah, that's yeah.
A shadow lover would be also someone who has sexual intercourse without any feelings of love.
Yeah, anything treating a lot of promiscuity would be an imaging of the kind of compulsive lover.
Dangerous Liaisons.
Dangerous Liaisons is a good film. The movie, did you see the Pacino film Sea of Love? Go to see Sea of Love if you can. 9.5 weeks. 9.5 weeks. One that I'd also like you to try to see as soon as possible is All That Jazz. Story of Bob Fosse. That's got so much of this energy in it. And if you just look at that All That Jazz movie, you will see the beauty of this thing and the death right there with the artist, just starkly portrayed, as if they were trying to teach us about the archetype of the lover by making that film. See, what else? Somebody in the realm of the senses. Any others? Fellini's 8.5. Angel Heart. That's really the archetypal shadow there. Huh?
Arabian Nights.
Arabian Nights. It's very interesting. The Arabian Nights. Be thinking about this, and we'll do this again next week, about things you ought to look at. That gives you plenty to start with. When you go home tonight, put on some rock and roll and turn it up loud.
Are you interested in knowing if you embody the essence of the lover in his fullness? Or if you are influenced by its more shadowy aspects? Why not take the Masculine Archetypes test? It's absolutely free and can guide you on a path of self-exploration. By gaining a deeper understanding of your masculine energies, you'll uncover your strengths and identify areas where you can grow. Don't miss out on this opportunity to embark on a journey of self-discovery. Take the masculine test today at www.masculinetest.com.